The most dangerous moment in a campaign is not always the first explosion. Sometimes it is the first silence. That is the real meaning of the reported Marine combat mission in the Arabian Sea. The story is not simply that U.S. Marines may be moving toward Iranian coastal targets. It is not only about boots on the ground, ospreys over dark water, or assault teams approaching facilities that Iran believed were protected by distance, darkness, and geography. The deeper story is the sequence that made such a mission possible. For months, the United States has been fighting Iran's military system layer by layer. Radar sites, communications towers, drone control nodes, coastal surveillance infrastructure, maritime tracking systems, fast boat staging facilities, command relays, underground support networks. Each strike looked, in isolation, like another episode in the long grinding contest over the Strait of Hormuz. But the source points toward a more important interpretation. Those strikes were not isolated. They were preparation. That is the angle that changes the whole story. A marine operation does not begin when an Osprey lifts off from an amphibious ship. It begins weeks or months earlier, when the systems that would degrade it are destroyed. It begins when the radar that would see the insertion is knocked out. It begins when the communications relay that would report the approach is damaged. It begins when fast attack boats that might respond are forced into hiding or lose real-time targeting support. It begins when the adversary's coastal command network becomes slow, partial, and confused. The mission begins before the Marines move. That is why this moment matters. If the reported operation is accurate, then the United States is not merely escalating from airstrikes to ground action. It is demonstrating that escalation is a sequence, and that the sequence has reached the stage where human access becomes possible. For months, Iran has been facing weapons launched from distance: carrier aircraft, drones, missiles, precision munitions, electronic warfare, and naval pressure. Those tools can destroy, suppress, blind, and delay. But they cannot always open a door, inspect a room, identify a commander, separate a decoy from a real target, remove equipment piece by piece, or make the kind of judgment that only people on the ground can make. That is what Marines bring to the battlefield. Not just firepower. Presence. That presence changes the nature of the conflict. A missile can strike a warehouse. A Marine team can enter it. A bomb can collapse a roof. A Marine team can confirm what was underneath. A drone can watch a facility. A Marine team can exploit it. Air power can suppress a coastal network. Ground forces can finish what suppression made reachable. This is why boots on the ground, even in a limited direct action role, carry a psychological weight that airstrikes do not. Airstrikes can be devastating, but they still allow the target state to keep distance between itself and the attacker. The enemy is above. The enemy is offshore. The enemy is a sensor track, a missile trail, a flash on a screen. A Marine operation collapses that distance. Suddenly, the enemy is not a bomb falling through the roof. The enemy is at the door. That is the threshold the source is describing. For Iran's commanders, the most alarming part of such a mission would not be the number of Marines involved. It would be the proof that the coastal defense system has been degraded badly enough that a sea-based assault force can approach before the warning chain can function. Iran's military posture around Hormuz was built on early detection, fast relay, coastal surveillance, swarming response, and the ability to make any American approach costly before it reaches Iranian territory. But that architecture depends on time. Radar buys time. Communications buy time. Surveillance buys time. Fast boats buy time. Command relays buy time. The United States has spent the campaign taking that time away. The reported Marine mission matters because it would exploit a battlefield where Iran no longer has enough warning time to react the way its doctrine requires. The Osprey becomes important in that environment not because it is invincible, but because it compresses the interval between launch and arrival. A slower aircraft gives observers, radar operators, command posts, or coastal units more time to detect, report, process, and respond. A tiltrotor assault platform moving from sea to shore at high speed narrows that window. When the radar network is already damaged and communications are already degraded, that narrowed window can become decisive. Speed is not only transportation. Speed is surprise. The Osprey's value in this scenario is that it connects a sea base to a shore target without requiring the slow buildup of a traditional amphibious assault. This is not the image of landing craft crawling toward a beach under daylight fire. This is a limited, high-speed, direct action problem. Move a force from ships operating outside the most dangerous envelope, reach a target before the warning chain matures, and exit before Iran can organize a coherent response. And that is why a Marine Expeditionary Unit exists. AMEU is not simply a group of Marines sitting on ships. It is a sea-based crisis force. It carries its own ground combat element, aviation element, logistics support, command structure, engineers, reconnaissance capability, and organic lift. It is designed for the space between pure naval presence and full-scale land war. It gives Washington an option that is more personal than missiles but smaller than invasion, more flexible than a carrier strike but less politically permanent than a land occupation. That option is especially powerful in the Arabian Sea because geography and politics make permanent basing complicated. A MEU can wait offshore. It can appear to be part of a broader deterrent posture. It can support evacuations, raids, seizures, interdictions, hostage rescue, embassy reinforcement, maritime security, or limited strikes. Its presence gives the president and commanders a tool that does not require asking a host nation to provide a runway for every mission. That is the sea-based advantage. Iran can watch ports, runways, and carrier groups. It can track public deployments and issue threats against visible warships. But an amphibious force carries ambiguity. It can wait, it can shift, it can train, it can posture, it can do nothing for weeks, and then suddenly become the center of the operation. That is what makes the reported mission so strategically sharp. The Marines were not the first tool used. They were the tool held back until the battle space had been shaped. This is the difference between capability and timing. The United States could have used Marines earlier in the conflict, at least in theory. But using them before the radar network was degraded would have meant higher risk. Using them before communications were disrupted would have given the IRGC more warning. Using them before maritime surveillance was suppressed would have made the approach more visible. Using them before fast boat staging areas were mapped and hit would have created a more dangerous extraction environment. So the United States waited. That waiting should not be confused with inability. That is one of the source's strongest points. Iran may have interpreted reliance on airstrikes, drone operations, naval interception, blockade enforcement, and radar suppression, and concluded that Washington was trying to avoid a more intimate form of escalation. But restraint is not the same as limitation. Sometimes restraint is sequencing. Sometimes a force holds back a tool not because it cannot use it, but because the conditions for using it have not yet matured. In this frame, the Marine mission becomes the exploitation phase. The radar strikes created the gap. The communication strikes slowed the response. The maritime suppression reduced the fast boat threat. The persistent surveillance identified targets. The Marine force exploits the opening. That is the operational logic. The targets described in the source also explain why ground access matters. Fast attack boat facilities, mine-laying infrastructure, communications relays, inland command nodes, and high-value personnel not always ideal airstrike targets. A warehouse can hide boats under cover. A bomb can destroy part of the building and still leave equipment recoverable. A communications node may be redundant, mobile, or hardened on small pieces of equipment spread across multiple structures. A commander may move through buildings where a strike risks collateral damage or uncertainty. Ground forces change that. On a mine, they can distinguish between decoys and real equipment. They can physically disable what a blast might only damage. They can collect intelligence. They can identify documents, electronics, communications gear, storage media, and maps. They can confirm whether a facility was operational or empty. They can capture or kill personnel if authorized. They can clear a building rather than simply crater it. This is the human advantage in a sensor-heavy war. Modern militaries can see more than ever, but seeing is not the same as knowing. A satellite can show a roof, a drone can show movement, signals intelligence can suggest activity, but someone on the ground can open a door and confirm what is inside. That is why direct action remains relevant in an age of precision strike. The purpose is not always destruction. Sometimes it is certainty, and certainty is priceless in this conflict. Iran has repeatedly relied on concealment, decoys, dispersed storage, civilian adjacent facilities, underground infrastructure, and ambiguous maritime networks. Air power can pressure such systems, but it often leaves questions. Were the boats inside the warehouse? Was the commander present? Was that antenna active or abandoned? Was the mine equipment destroyed or moved? Was the drone control console there or only a relay? Was the facility real or a trap? A Marine team can answer questions a missile cannot. That is what makes the possibility of this mission so consequential. It is not just an attack. It is a fact-finding weapon. The historical precedent matters here. Operation Praying Mantis in 1988 remains one of the clearest examples of direct U.S.-Iran military confrontation in the Gulf. The United States retaliated after the USS Samuel B. Roberts struck an Iranian mine, and U.S. forces destroyed Iranian platforms and naval assets in a rapid, punishing operation. That battle taught Iran a hard lesson. Conventional naval confrontation with the United States was not a path to victory. The IRGC's later doctrine grew partly from that lesson. Do not present a fleet to be destroyed in a set-piece battle. Use swarms, mines, drones, fast boats, coastal missiles, ambiguity, and economic pressure. Make the battlefield messy. Make defense expensive. Make escalation politically costly. Make the United States pay for every mile of maritime security. That doctrine was designed to avoid another praying mantis. But the reported Marine mission suggests that the campaign may be bending back toward direct engagement anyway. Not because Iran failed to develop asymmetric tools, but because the United States has been dismantling the systems that make those tools effective. Swarm boats need surveillance. Drone attacks need launch infrastructure and commands. Mine laying, coastal missile batteries, staging points, and small craft. Coastal missile batteries need targeting data. The asymmetric system is still a system. Break the system and direct action becomes possible again. That is the nightmare for the IRGC. Kai. Its doctrine was built to keep the fight at the level of harassment, cost imposition, and de-naval pressure. But if its radars go down, if its communications are degraded, if its maritime picture collapses, if its boats cannot assemble safely, if its command nodes are mapped, then the doctrine loses coherence. The fast boat becomes just a boat. The coastal site becomes just a target. The warehouse becomes reachable. The commander becomes vulnerable. That is why the mission's psychological effect may exceed the physical damage. At the IRGC level, the message is direct. The facilities you thought were protected by concealment can be entered. The buildings you thought were safe from air-delivered munitions because of uncertainty can be physically cleared. The commanders who thought distance and coastal defenses gave them time may no longer have that time. The war is no longer purely remote. At the civilian political level inside Iran, the message is different. The conflict is crossing thresholds. If diplomacy fails, the next phase will not necessarily look like the last one. It may become more invasive, more personal, and more destabilizing for the regime's internal power structure. At the international level, the message is broader. The United States has been holding capability in reserve. Carrier strikes, naval blockade, drone defense, and radar suppression are not the full menu. Amphibious forces, marine direct action, and sea-based ground combat options remain available. That matters to China. It matters to Russia. It matters to Gulf states. It matters to every actor watching whether American power is stretched or still capable of sequencing multiple operations at once. China will study the timeline carefully. A force that first suppresses sensors and then exploits the opening with fast sea-based insertion has obvious relevance to any future Western Pacific crisis. Chinese planners think constantly about detection, denial, anti-access systems, island chains, amphibious movements, long-range fires, drones, and the problem of keeping U.S. forces far from Chinese-controlled territory. A marine operation after radar suppression in the Arabian Sea is not a Taiwan scenario, but it demonstrates a principle China cannot ignore. A sensor network that is degraded in layers can suddenly create openings for forces that were waiting offshore. Moscow often bets that U.S. attention is finite and that a major Middle East conflict pulls American focus away from Europe. But a marine mission executed while naval blockade operations, carrier sorties, mine clearance, air defense, and diplomacy continue would signal that the United States is not necessarily choosing one operational stream at the expense of all others. The ability to maintain multiple pressures at once is itself a strategic message. Gulf states will read the mission in a more immediate way. For months, they have lived with the consequences of Iranian drones, missiles, maritime disruption, and attacks on infrastructure. They do not only want defensive reassurance. They want to know whether the United States can remove the sources of the threat. A marine raid against coastal infrastructure, if successful, would show offensive willingness beyond interception, not purely passive. It would tell Gulf partners that the U.S. posture is not purely passive, but the risks are serious. A marine operation is not a missile strike. If something goes wrong, the consequences are different. Aircraft can be lost, Marines can be captured, a ground engagement can become a political crisis. Iranian defenders may resist, local commanders may improvise. Civilian proximity may complicate rules of engagement. A limited raid can become a broader firefight if reinforcements arrive. The public response inside Iran could be explosive if the regime frames the mission as an invasion. As that is why the threshold matters. The United States would not cross it casually. A decision to put Marines ashore, even briefly, is a decision to accept risks that remote strike avoids. It means planners believe the target's value justifies the risk, or that the broader message is necessary, or that the degraded Iranian defense network has created a rare window that may not remain open. This is why the timing is central. The reported mission occurs after months of strikes on Keshem Island, coastal radar, drone control sites, and communications towers. It occurs after Iranian ceasefire violations, missile attacks, staged ship seizures, and false victory claims. It occurs after the diplomatic track has struggled against hardline resistance. It occurs after the U.S. has built a detailed intelligence picture of Iranian coastal facilities. In other words, the mission is not a sudden impulse. It is a consequence. It is what happens when a campaign designed to shape the battle space finally creates a usable opening, and the political leadership decides that the opening must be exploited before Iran adapts. That adaptation point is important. Blind spots do not stay open forever. Radar networks can be repaired, communications relays can be replaced, mobile sensors can be moved, watch posts can be reinforced, fast boats can disperse, commanders can change routines. A degraded system remains dangerous, and given enough time, it can reconstitute parts of itself. A raid exploits a temporary advantage. That is why the source's language about minutes is so powerful. In the operational darkness of a degraded coastline, time becomes the decisive resource. How many minutes before an observer reports the sound? How many minutes before the report reaches a commander? How many minutes before the commander believes it? How many minutes before defenders are alerted? How many minutes before a fast boat can launch? How many minutes before an air defense team can move? How many minutes before the assault team has completed its objective? The United States has been buying those minutes through every prior strike. Radar destruction buys minutes. On a communication disruption buys minutes. On a command paralysis buys minutes. On a Osprey speed buys minutes. On a surprise buys minutes. On a the mission succeeds or fails inside that time economy. On a that is the real operational drama. On a not simply whether Marines are brave, that is assumed. On a the question is whether the campaign has stolen enough time from Iran's response chain for Marines to arrive, act, and leave before the IRGC can turn scattered local resistance into coordinated defense. That is what Iran has no idea what is coming means in the strongest analytical sense. It does not mean no Iranian soldier can ever look up and see aircraft. It means Iran no longer has the integrated system Nesser action. A watchtower may see something. A guard may hear something. A radio may carry a report. But if radar is gone, communications are degraded, command is fractured, and response units are slow or blind, then the observation may not become action quickly enough. Information without coordination is not awareness. Awareness without response is not defense. That is the vulnerability the Marines would exploit. The targets described in the source fall into categories that matter directly to the Hormuz fight. Fast attack boat facilities threaten shipping and convoy operations. Mine-laying infrastructure threatens the mine clearance effort and tanker safety. Communications relays enable drone and swarm coordination. High-value commanders tie fragmented units into operational plans. Destroying or exploiting these nodes does not simply remove objects. It disrupts the future pattern of Iranian action. That future effect is the point. A raid is not valuable only because something burns that night. It is valuable if the next drone attack is harder to coordinate, the next mine-laying attempt is delayed, the next fast boat swarm lacks staging equipment, the next commander has to operate through a broken chain, and the next negotiation takes place under the knowledge that concealment no longer guarantees survival. This is how limited ground action supports diplomacy. It is not invasion. It is pressure by proximity. The United States does not need to occupy territory to change Tehran's calculation. It only needs to show that the line between offshore pressure and onshore access can be crossed when necessary. That possibility forces Iran to rethink where it is safe, what infrastructure it can trust, and whether continued escalation is worth the risk of more intimate American action. That is why the mission's strategic meaning would be larger than its tactical footprint. An airstrike says, we can hit you. A raid says, we can reach you. Those are different messages. Hitting a target can be absorbed as part of war. Reaching a target can create deeper fear because it implies access, intelligence, and timing. It implies that someone knew where to go, when to move, what defenses were weak, and how to get there. It implies that the enemy's hidden map is no longer hidden. This is the same psychological effect special operations often create. The physical damage may be limited, but the question it leaves behind is enormous. What else do they know? That question spreads inside the command structure. If one coastal facility was reachable, is another? If one commander was vulnerable, who else is? If one warehouse was entered, how many others are mapped? If one radar blind spot was exploited, where is the next? If one Osprey formation arrived undetected, what does that say about the rest of the coastline? Uncertainty becomes pressure. Pressure becomes hesitation. Hesitation becomes opportunity. That is the strategic rhythm. Still, a careful analysis must separate what is confirmed from what is claimed. The uploaded source frames the Marine mission as underway in secret. By definition, such claims may not be independently verifiable, as a scenario built around a plausible operational logic. Marines positioned offshore, MV-22 mobility, degraded Iranian coastal sensors, historical U.S.-Iran naval precedent, and the unique value of ground access against targets' air power cannot fully confirm. That caution does not weaken the analysis. It strengthens it, because the core argument does not depend on knowing every classified detail. The broader point is clear. If a Marine mission is launched after the systematic destruction of Iran's coastal radar and communications infrastructure, then that mission should be understood as the exploitation of a shaped battle space. It is not an isolated escalation. It is the harvest of earlier suppression. That is the doctrine. Shape first. Exploit second. The source also suggests that hardline Iranian actions have pushed the conflict toward this threshold. Missile salvos, airport bombings, ship seizures, false victory claims, and failed diplomacy all contribute to the perception that remote pressure alone may not be enough to produce a counterpart capable of making and enforcing commitments. In that frame, the Marine mission is not only a military act. It is a signal to Iranian factions, moderates. The window for a negotiated framework is closing. Continued escalation will bring forms of pressure you have not yet faced. The cost of letting the IRGC dictate the pace is rising. To the military command, the United States still has unused tools. That is the political message beneath the operation. Every military action in this conflict has a diplomatic shadow. They tell negotiators that the surveillance only about radar. They tell negotiators that the surveillance network is about missiles. They tell negotiators that inventory can be reduced before it is capped. Naval blockades are not only about oil. They tell negotiators that revenue can disappear. A Marine raid is not only about a facility. It tells negotiators that distance can collapse. The purpose is to alter calculation. That is why the phrase restraint is not limitation is so important. The United States may have been avoiding certain categories of action because the diplomatic track still existed. But if Iran interprets that restraint as proof that those categories are unavailable, it misreads the campaign. A power can avoid using a tool while still preparing to use it. A threshold can remain uncrossed while the conditions for crossing it are being built. The Marine mission, as framed by the source, would be the moment that hidden preparation becomes visible, and that visibility changes everything, For months, the war may have appeared to Iran as a contest of missiles, drones, ships, and aircraft. Those are serious enough. But ground access introduces a new fear, the possibility that American forces can move from watching a target to physically touching it. That is the difference between surveillance and intrusion, between pressure and penetration, between a target being known and a target being entered. Iran's coastal infrastructure was designed to support asymmetric warfare from sanctuary. Fast boats could hide in covered spaces. Mines could be staged near the water. Communications relays could pass instructions. Commanders could operate from facilities assumed to be too risky or too politically sensitive for direct U.S. entry. If Marines can reach those spaces, sanctuary shrinks. That is what the IRGC has been trying to avoid since Praying Mantis. It wanted a war fought at standoff range, where cheap systems could impose costs and ambiguity could protect escalation. It did not want American forces inside the physical infrastructure of the Hormuz campaign. It did not want its warehouses opened, its staging areas cleared, its equipment seized, or its commanders confronted at close range. That is exactly why the threshold matters. The battlefield is becoming personal. Not total war, not occupation, not regime change by landing force, but personal in the sense that the tools of pressure are no longer only remote. The United States may be saying if your radar is gone, if your communications are broken, if your maritime network is exposed, if your diplomacy stalls, then the next step is not necessarily another bomb. It may be a team at the facility you thought was safe. That is a different level of pressure, and pressure works through imagination as much as destruction. Iran's commanders now have to imagine the next target. They have to imagine whether the facility they are sleeping in has been watched for months. They have to imagine whether their guard rotations are known. They have to imagine whether the communications tower that survived the last strike is already on the next mission plan. They have to imagine whether the sound over the water is nothing, or whether the warning system that would have told them otherwise no longer exists. That is what a blind spot does. Makes every shadow dangerous. The question now is whether this kind of pressure produces a decision or a wider war. Limited marine action can shock an adversary in negotiation, but it can also trigger revenge. Iran may respond with missiles, drones, proxy attacks, cyber operations, mine deployments, or attacks on shipping. It may try to capture images, bodies, or wreckage for propaganda. It may claim an invasion. It may pressure Gulf states. It may accelerate hardline arguments against compromise. That is why the mission, if real, must be tied to a clear political objective. Force without a political path becomes drift. Force with a path can become coercive diplomacy. The difference is whether the target understands what action will stop the pressure. If Iran believes nothing it does can reduce American escalation, it may fight harder. If Iran understands that verifiable commitments can halt the sequence, the pressure has a purpose. That is the final strategic question. Is the Marine mission designed to destroy a facility or to force a decision? The best answer is probably both. The immediate objective may be tactical. Destroy fast boat equipment, disable mine-laying infrastructure, or remove specific personnel. But the larger objective is political. Prove that the United States can cross another threshold, and that continued bad faith escalation will not remain confined to remote exchanges. This is why the operation would be so important. It would show that the conflict is not static, it is moving. Every Iranian refusal, every attack, every ship seizure, every missile salvo, every false victory claim, every broken ceasefire pushes the campaign into a new category. First surveillance, then blockade, then airstrikes, then radar suppression, then underground penetration, then maritime interdiction, then potentially ground access. The sequence is the message. Iran's mistake would be reading each step separately. The United States appears to be building cumulative pressure. Each step creates conditions for the next. Each strike removes a layer. Each layer removed expands the range of available options. The Marine mission is simply the most visible proof that previous operations were not random. They were removing the exact defenses that would have made this step too risky. That is why the reported mission may be the most significant development since the arrival of major U.S. naval forces in the theater. It does not necessarily mean the war is becoming an invasion. It means the campaign has matured into a phase where human access is possible, and where the United States is willing to use that possibility as leverage. For Iran, that is terrifying. For Gulf partners, it is reassurance. For China and Russia, it is data. For diplomats, it is pressure. For the IRGC, it is a warning that the distance between the Arabian Sea and the Iranian coast is no longer measured in miles. It is measured in the minutes left after the radar goes dark. That is the real story. The Marines are not the beginning of the campaign. They are the proof that the campaign has been shaping the night around them. And if the source's scenario is accurate, then Iran's commanders are not simply facing another strike. They are facing the consequence of everything they failed to protect before it arrived.